Yes, sir.
Hi, Beth Redmond here. Welcome to Sound and Vision. We have a new episode for you, so we hope you'll stick around and enjoy the show.
Radiant and elegant, lyric smile from crimson lips. You cannot miss my reaction. I scoop you up and drink from your cup called fate. You fascinate me. How will I meet her? How will I meet her? How will I meet her? She was graceful as a butterfly, brilliant to the naked eye, qualified as passerby, radiant and elegant, graceful as a butterfly, brilliant to the naked eye, qualified as passerby, radiant and elegant. Well, flower beds the sea.
Welcome to Happiness in the City. This is Barbara, and I'd like today to focus our attention on something that is at this point in political development's key issue, and that is linguistic communication. I would like us to focus on the wisdom of the ages. And wisdom of the ages teaches us that language is faculty that is unique in the earth to human beings. There are diverse ways in which people communicate, and I wanted you to look at Wikipedia article on language, so that we will have a little authority support. So this is the entry on Wikipedia, and let's read it together. So in Wikipedia we see that language is the ability to acquire and use complex systems of communication, particularly the human ability to do so, and a language is any specific example of such a system. So here we have definition that is complex in itself, because language is ability to acquire and use complex system of communication. Let's focus on this. Language is ability to acquire complex systems of communication. So we need to look at the complex knowledge we have about language before we condemn or praise people on the grounds of the so-called hate speech or love speech. The concept of love speech and hate speech is not concept that derives from the natural law of the way we are created. The concepts of hate speech and love speech are really very recent. I did not grow up with those concepts, so those concepts are very strange to me. And they have been used to destroy linguistic communication that traditionally has been under realm of politics. So we have a situation which we understand language as the ability to acquire and use complex systems of communication. And that means that we have within us capacity to have complex models of social and linguistic systems. And that has to be used as the foundation for any evaluation of what those systems of communication are. In other words, before tools of repression and punishment are used against language, we have to understand what it is we are doing. What is language as the ability to acquire complex systems of communication, and political disagreements, which is realm of social relationships. So we have to have clarity over what is language and what are social relationships, because matters of love and hate refer to social relationships, whereas language is the ability to acquire and to use complex systems of communication. Let's analyze the second part of Wikipedia definition of language. The second part talks about that communication and language as particularly the human ability to do so. And a language is any specific example of such a system. So we have a situation in which we have language as the generic, universal name for our ability to acquire complex systems of communication, and then we have particular languages like English or Polish or Russian or Chinese or Japanese or German, etc., etc. So we have to understand that in order for us to come to healing over what is currently happening in relationships, we have to have deep understanding that relationships depend on communication and language, but relationships is more than a language. Language is part of human communication, but language is also different from any forms that are non-linguistic communication. So, in order for us to have peace in what is happening today, we have to stop condemning language for what is political disagreement. Because if we condemn language or parts of language under the concept of hate speech, then we create dissociative disorder in which human communication is blocked from language. And when human communication is blocked from linguistic interaction, then we end up with non-linguistic violence. And this is what is happening today. We saw this very painful situation in Charlesville in which linguistic communication was really blocked between the two groups in conflict with each other. And then, in the frustration of not having that round table in which people can have intercessors and work things out through linguistic communication, instead of that linguistic communication, there was pain of frustration, inability to communicate anger, and we ended up in horrific tragedy that ended with death and injuries. Since my intention is vision of peace, I tried to find ways to prevent something like this to happen in the future by understanding the deep structures, the deep levels of causality for that kind of violence to come to the surface of human relationships. I think that the judges, the government officials, police have to learn about linguistics. Some of you know I have Masters of Arts in Applied Linguistics, so I took many years of studies in this area of very complex body of knowledge about linguistic communication. We have to have that knowledge about language. So instead of condemning the natural faculty and ability of human beings to communicate and to acquire, we have to know the difference between non-linguistic behavior and linguistic behavior. Because blocking language is a violent act in itself. And violence begets violence. So in order for us to stop that violence that is happening right now, we have to stop violating ability of human beings to acquire communication systems through the natural faculty of language. And of course, in America, we primarily use English language. In other countries, it's different. But without liberty of language, violence accumulates. It's suffocated, it's repressed, but it's there. And in moments of weakness or in moments of some opportunity, that violence manifests as physical violence because there is no way to communicate through voice. Many of you study religion, study the Bible. Many of you study about relationships between human life and divine through other forms of religion, but we all understand that in all forms of religion, language is considered sacred faculty of life. And there are different ways of dealing with this, but it's considered something that is very important for human life to have peace. So on this matter, I find agreement in all religions of the earth, at least those that I had great fortune to study at Harvard University. And I believe that as there are differences in different religions about how we relate to the divine, how we relate to each other, we relate to the past, to our ancestors, those are different things. But we all agree that language is faculty, ability that we all have as members of mankind, as human beings. So on this issue, we all agree that blocking language is a form of violence that blocks diverse groups of people and people from diverse religions to come to conversation and communication so that they can work out areas of agreement and peace. Because today actually is a situation in which we are pretty much at peace. There are some wars on the margins, but this has been a time in which mankind is searching for peace. But we have to know the right way to search for peace and achieve it, and the wrong way. So blocking language instead of dealing with errors of behavior is an error in itself. So I recommend that instead of attacking people for hate speech and praising them for love speech, that we'll drop those concepts altogether. They are really concepts that are so vague and so disconnected from language as ability that they create more trouble than they solve. And instead, let's return to wisdom and knowledge about language and diverse languages, and then revive knowledge about different ways in which language communicates. Every linguistic culture of the earth has storytelling traditions. Storytelling include metaphors, symbols, fictional narration, partly fictional, partly based on true stories. We have storytelling through mass media. It's a very diverse, amazing, complex heritage of human beings to tell the story of the past and to pass them on to the new generation. Those who study very developed literatures like English literature, American literature, Polish, Latin, Italian, Russian, French, they know that over centuries literary devices and literary ways developed at a very high level, and we use diverse metaphors. We use sarcasm, we use hyperbole, all kinds of imagery within the context of the language. Those stories are also ways to train our memories. And by using evaluation of stories as a form of communication of complexity of human experience is the right way of dealing with our heritage. But coming into those stories and then evaluating them by condemning what is quote, quote, hate speech in them and what is called love speech in them really destroys the memory of our heritage and destroys human beings who use those evaluations, because our brain does not have ability of hate speech or love speech, but of speech, language. And then the content of it as acquired way to communicate is something that needs to be connected to the foundation of language, but not cut off with the language, because then we seize the ability to communicate. So I think that we have to very seriously rethink the way we have been using those concepts of hate speech and love speech in social media, in governments, in international relations. And we, in my opinion, should agree to just stop using those very strange concepts and come back to classical way in which we deal with political differences. And that is through conversation, through conferences of politics that include diverse speakers, which then are given ability to connect and communicate. Many people change their ideas and political attitudes as they are persuaded. Many of you know about the great art of rhetorics, in which great orators had the ability to persuade crowds to change their opinion on certain matters. But they had to reach the understanding of those people's minds. So I'd rather have great oratory continued and great opportunities for people to connect with each other through living language than to have a situation of this absolutely tragic condemnation, which people cut each other off just because they disagree on certain matters. Sometimes they just disagree on one point and they would be attacked as somebody that should not be allowed to speak in a campus or to be honored. This has never happened in the history of mankind like that. So we have to come back to our senses of language and linguistic communication, and we have to focus the energy on creation of points of contact and opportunities for people to work things out. For instance, in Charlottesville, we should have had roundtable discussions. We should have also been given two opportunities to hear great orators, and they are in the United States of America. They are at the great universities, but they are so intimidated from speaking, lest they say a few arguments and be branded as haters, then they just are silently pursuing their little scientific or literary project. So we end up in a situation of more and more and more violence, and that violence became so dangerous at this point that I ask you to develop nonviolent ways of expressing your opinions. Look into the history of literature in your particular countries. There are translations from many nations. Learn to acquire ways of peaceful communication of differences. Learn to communicate your points of view through movies, through television shows, through all kinds of stories, but stop that murderous violence. This is not the way that will have any future, because blood has voice too. And we have voice of blood within our living lives, but also the voice of blood, those who perished under such circumstances, also calls for justice. So we have to respect each other's lives and bloodlines and differences by using proven methods of communication, and we should come back to political discourses and stop the discourse of demand and force. Politics by nature is the art of compromise. It's the end of politics that creates war. But so long as we have political discussions and political ways of finding communication and words to connect with each other peacefully and lovingly, is the best way. Because I believe that really what we all need today is living voice of love, which only comes from God, and then living, loving connection with each other. Loving means unconditionally, just the way the opponents or our friends are. Because if you don't love your enemy, if you cut all the connections, then you will never have peace. So it's actually also self-interest, well understood, to shield language from violence and to learn to work out our relationships through language. Thank you so much for listening to my remarks, and I will be here next week for another edition of Happiness and the